Never heard of
Ad
that.
Never heard
Adolescence.
of
Yeah,
it.
same.
So, wait, who said? What did you say, Spencer?
I haven't heard of it either.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's
I'm
What's it
actually
called.
on?
surprised. Maybe it's just like my algorithm that like a lot of people were talking about it, and the current narrative. It's especially big in the UK. Like some member of parliament brought it up because it is kind of about a little bit about like the manosphere and its influence on particularly young boys. So of course, like it's the kind of liberal left media and people on social media are like, this is so important. We need to talk about this. Incel culture, Andrew Tate. And I say like, yes, but I think they're missing the point of the rest of the show because it's a 4-episode miniseries. Each episode is shot in a singular take. So it feels more like you're watching a play. And there's so much more to it than just manosphere, men bad kind of thing that I think a lot of these like influencers and whatnot are latching on to. But hopefully Dave and I are going to do a What's Right episode soon because I've got things to say about this show.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I do want to. I mean, Anne, I the way I see it is, this is that. So, I mean, we're not going to do it like as the only thing we talk about. We're going to tie it into monasteries and churches, and we're going to ask about what those are. But first of all, what's up, everybody? I see you out there. I'm watching you. I see you on a hike. I know that you're all on hikes right now because I can see right here. We've got the audience cam. It's really cool to have an audience cam coming to us live from wherever Spencer's at in the world. It's a very beautiful place. There's a little bit of snow, it looks like. What do you think, Benjamin? Is there some snow around there?
Looks like there's some snow where Spencer is. There's no snow out where I am at this time.
Nice. Yeah, there's no snow out where I'm at, which is in Phoenix. And for everybody who's been keeping up with the tour, you know where we're at. You know what's going on. But for those who don't, yeah, look, I mean, not just Phoenix, but this is Nance's spot. I think he is in a car on his way back here right now. And so we'll hopefully get a little appearance from him and Will. But I wanted to take a moment here to welcome everybody to this very special little bonus episode of Why I Left and turn it over to my co-host here. I will want to bring it back to Adolescence, but we also want to talk about monasteries and churches. But Benjamin, what are we coming out of right now?
Yeah, we're coming out of Nina Power's talk on nature. I also just want to say real quick that people don't realize that Dave always looks this good. It's just that he rarely has a camera that allows you to see how good he actually looks.
Oh my God.
I hope that people will remember that Dave looks this good
Yes,
when he's
people.
in front of other cameras in other situations with internet that's not as good.
Look how good Anne looks. Isn't it amazing? Yeah. Hello, TV. Hello, TV land. We're really just micro celebs out here. What's going on? Theory pop stars. That's
But
what it
yes,
makes
we
me
came
feel
out
like.
of this.
That's what it feels like. This kind of a camera makes it feel like it's about how we look, but also it's seductive. Sorry. Anyway, what are we coming out of? Yeah, Nina's class.
Yeah, we're coming out of Nina's class. Nina was giving a talk about nature, particularly in the work of Manet, and we were kind of exploring some of the difficulties with nature as a concept. Really, Nina's whole course involves this wrestling with nature, a concept that on some level we feel people use it all the time. It does seem to have a continuing importance. And yet also it tends to feel constraining or oppressive or scary in various ways. It's a concept that both never goes away, but which also, when it's invoked, is often used in a way that feels pushy and maybe arbitrary and off-putting. So we were wrestling with these different feelings that people have about nature and these different uses, and how it can often seem like what is natural is clear in any particular situation. But then if you get away from that time period and you look back on how the concept was used in some other time period, then you start to feel on shaky footing. So I was talking about the Aztecs and the ways that the Spanish regarded the Aztecs and the various other tribes that they encountered. They didn't go, oh, these are people living naturally and we're living in some sort of artificial social order. No, they said, we're the ones living naturally because we're living in accordance with man's nature as described by Aristotle and Aquinas and the church. And they are living outside of the city and outside of the church, and therefore they're not able to realize themselves as men. And therefore they aren't men in some sense and have to be dealt with on that basis. And so while there's some interest in these kind of Catholic natural law theory, there's also this implication in Catholic natural law theory that I think is very off-putting to contemporary people, but also I think you can understand why it would be an attractive way to think if you were a Spaniard washed up on the shores of Mexico and you're confronted with various tribes, some of which want to rip your heart out and sacrifice you, and others which are actively seeking your protection from the tribes that are looking to do that. And you have to decide. You have to make a decision what to do. If you just try to live peaceably on the coastline and set up a trade port or something, you're going to get raided by the people who want to rip your hearts out. So that isn't really an option. You could just go back where you came from and leave this continent alone forever. But that seems like a difficult thing to do. And you might do that, but will everybody else do that? What will other people do when they confront this situation? And if you really do think that the people over there are people, how can you leave them to deal with this? How can you leave them in this situation where they're being potentially farmed for spare parts?
I guess my question then is, so of course there's a lot more that happened in this lecture and then discussion. But one of the questions I'm going to want to bring it back to here is the way we use natural law or natural right really based in this historical moment. Or why does it become significant in this historical moment when, as you say, these conquistadors, they are drawing off of all of these people who came before, right? So Aquinas and Aristotle and the church. And so if those entities were already around and had already thought about natural law, then why is this sort of the point we want to keep coming back to, specifically this moment of, say, Spaniards meeting or exploiting or trying to manage relations with what I don't know what to say, indigenous populations across the world or whatever. So yeah, I just want to hear about that.
The reason that this is what sticks out to me is because this is the big moment where international law gets formulated historically, and it gets formulated on the basis of natural law. And it gets formulated in a way that has to explain, legitimate, and justify the relationships which are then formed at that time.
International law is the reason.
Yeah. So the argument that was made at this time is that whereas in the past it was assumed that you could only really interact with other Christians, you can interact with other people who live naturally. So you can have civil social relations with Muslim states. That's okay, because they still follow a certain natural code. They still live in accordance with what's natural. But the tribes in the Americas, they don't follow the same kinds of rules. So you can have a contract with a Muslim state or with merchants in a Muslim state and expect that they'll honor the terms of that contract. If you travel to Muslim territory, you will not simply be killed for trespassing. There are certain norms of behavior that you could expect from Muslim states. And this is in part because a lot of Islamic law, thought, jurisprudence, etc., also came from Aristotle through figures like Averroes. So there wasn't altogether that much difference between the way that the Islamic states operated and the way the Christian states operated. Certainly there was enough commonality that they could say that there was still something natural that the Muslims were in touch with. So these guys think that they have this more expansive notion of what you can do because they're no longer excluding the Muslims. Now you can have all sorts of relations with Muslims, and that's fine. But in the Americas, if you wash up on shore, you can't be sure that you will not simply be killed for trespassing. And if you try to trade or you try to make agreements, you can't be sure that people will honor those agreements or that they won't simply kill you for trying to talk to them. And they'll also engage in all sorts of other practices that are considered out of bounds. So during this period, the thought of people like Grotius is that there is a set of natural behaviors which is inclusive of the Muslims, but excludes these pagan tribes. These pagan tribes are behaving in a way which contravenes nature, and therefore they have to be brought into accordance with nature. Now, when we talk about the natural today, oftentimes people are talking about technology versus a kind of biological person. And then the differences among different ways of biologically living have been kind of flattened, I think largely by capitalism. At this point, it seems like people all over the world live in broadly similar ways. And the ways in which tribes live differently have been forgotten or glossed over, or they've been minimized. There's been an attempt to kind of deny the degree to which this could quite seriously be a very, very different way of doing things. At this point, the tribes that are still left in the world are occupying very small areas of territory. They are not regularly interacted with by large numbers of people, and they don't pose any kind of problem for people generally, apart from very specific cases where perhaps you might want to develop certain parts of the Amazon rainforest. So generally, people are not encountering the kinds of problems that people encountered back in the 1500s and 1600s. And so now the natural is used to try to make a cut between the human and the machine. And in doing this, often the concept of the natural that comes out of the Middle Ages is traded upon or invoked. So there will be appeals to Catholic natural law theory. But then as soon as you start to get into some of the original implications of that theory, what that theory really meant and why it was really formulated in the Middle Ages, there's a certain hands-off. There's oh, wait, we don't mean it like that. We don't want that. And this is in part, the Catholic Church itself changes its emphasis a little bit in terms of what it talks about, in terms of what it centers. It's not that the Catholic Church repudiates the things that it's done, but it, in different time periods, will emphasize different parts of its teaching in a way which it feels is relevant to the times in which things are operating. So you don't hear the natural deployed by the Catholic Church so much in the way it was deployed then in relation to those kinds of cases, but you will still hear it invoked in relation to families, like women or men should have children. They should fulfill certain natural roles that they ostensibly have. The Pope wrote this whole letter about how these people are adopting pets when they should be having children, or if they can't have children, adopting children, and that by adopting pets instead, they're living against their nature. They're violating the body that God gave them, which tasks them in some way. This, of course, did have implications with regard to the tribes, because this was not just reducible to reproduction. Catholic natural law theory wasn't just a bunch of claims about sex in the family. It included claims about everything and how to do everything. And there's been a tendency to like some of the bits and pieces of it, especially among conservatives, as they relate to the family and to sex. But then when you start to get into what does it really mean to go back to Catholicism, what does that really mean? Well, the way to make it not really mean something is to take the authority of the church as the structure. So if the church chooses not to emphasize that old stuff and to emphasize different stuff now, because it feels that right now it would be better to emphasize that different stuff, to simply submit to that and go along with it. But a lot of the people who are converting to Catholicism lately have been doing it imagining that they know what church doctrine is and have been kind of trying to use it themselves, which isn't really what you're supposed to do as a Catholic. As a Catholic, you're supposed to take the direction of the church as to which particular parts of the doctrine you emphasize.
It's a very Protestant thing it's a very Protestant, secular, individual, liberal way of going into the Catholicism, isn't it?
Yeah. So this is something I was kind of wrestling with in listening to Nina's talk, because there's certainly a part of Nina and a part of Nina's talk which is sympathetic to Catholicism, but then
Right.
always on its own terms. And Nina was telling me a little while ago about she went and talked to some actual Catholic integralists recently, some like real Catholics. And for them, she's too far left.
Sure.
They don't really see her as having taken up their concepts,
Right.
or they view it as a kind of selective taking up. And so when I try to do the natural, there's a part of me that always wants to understand these traditions involving these big abstractions kind of immanently. So I'm always wanting to do due diligence by these medievals and go, but what did it really mean? And give them all the credit that I can give them and let them speak. And so like when I'm raising the question of the Aztecs, it's not that I want to defend what the conquistadors did, nor is it that I want to say that because the concept of the natural implies this activity, that therefore the concept of the natural is bad or has to be thrown out. I want to wrestle with how the concept of the natural gives rise to that kind of predicament and to really take it as a predicament.
Hmm. How it comes from that kind of predicament and how it can be helpful in such predicaments.
How it both gives rise to that predicament and then produces a solution, but one that maybe isn't fully satisfactory from the point of view of different abstractions. Because I think anytime you emphasize one of these abstractions to the exclusion of the others, there are certain things that it will tend to notice, that it will bring out, and then other things that it will tend to run over in the course of bringing out that particular thing.
Totally.
And the natural is this, the reason that people are wanting to bring it up, I think, is that there seem to be certain things that they're not able to say under the headings of liberty or equality, or even of God, or they're seeming to have a difficult time even using God to say these things. I think especially in Europe, it's quite hard to use God to say things. So the heading of the natural becomes the abstraction under which these claims are made. But then, if you really do come all the way back to the natural and make that the abstraction, well, then you get into these quite difficult situations where all of a sudden you confront some other way of living that previously wasn't possible or that you previously weren't aware of. So in the case of what's happening in terms of technological change, it's stuff that previously wasn't possible. You can live in ways now that you simply couldn't before. There are ways of living sustainably that someone can actually do, that can actually be reproduced, that previously couldn't have been done. So in the period where they couldn't have been done, they would have struck people as obviously unnatural. But if it is the case that people can do them now, then they have this candidature for naturalness. And so then there's an attempt to want to say why nonetheless they aren't natural, even though they're becoming widespread and common. Because the thing about the natural is it involves looking at what's around and what can actually be sustained, what's actually compatible with maintaining human life. So if you can live in this very technologized way, then that would in some sense suggest that this in fact is or could be, or perhaps always already was latently natural. And so, the way that they made the cut back then is to say the natural is not simply what's compatible with being alive. The natural means living a fully realized human life that involves actually realizing certain capacities that men have, at least men. And if you aren't realizing those capacities, then you're not living like a man. You're living in some inferior way, and therefore you can make an intervention. And I think that there is some of this thinking in the critique of some of the contemporary technologized ways of living. And there was also this critique when the conquistadors came to Mesoamerica and confronted what they found there. And I think that it isn't totally possible to disentangle these things or treat them as completely separate arguments. It is in part the same thinking that's going on. And I don't mean that to invalidate it necessarily, but just to make us wrestle with it. If we're really going to say this way of living that seems sustainable through technology is nonetheless unnatural, then why can't it be said with the conquistador that this way of living, which seems to have been sustainable in the Americas, is unnatural? And I think the way that people have done this is they've tried to associate the natural with a kind of primitive pre-social or pre-civil living. But that isn't the way it was understood historically, and certainly not the way it was understood by the church. For the church, the natural is associated with living in the church, with the church,
Right.
through the church.
It's not like the state of nature where, that we got to get back to before socialization. It's actually a Bildung is our nature in that sense.
Yeah. It's not this, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, thing that came in later on. It's a view of human life which takes, life in towns, life in cities, social, commercial life as itself constitutive of what we are. Living in community as constitutive of what we are. Even say someone like Hume has this thought of tribe as people who, recognize each other as having value because of a kind of close tie or close contact. And that this is the way that we typically live. It's not in total isolation.
100%. I think that's such a good grounding for us all now to set up for this conversation. So that I think that really does give everybody watching now. What's up? How many of you are there? I don't know, a good chunk. Gives you a sense for what we're coming out of and kind of where we're at. But we're gonna get into some stuff here. But I want to. So Anne, you did hear from Anne, in the background there, at the very beginning of this stream. But also, we are joined today by Rebecca Rose Prentice and Jasper. And I just had this realization. First of all, like, oh my God, here we are obsessing out. We're talking about all this stuff, but we haven't actually said you're hosts on Why Left for the first time. Great to have you both. Everyone give it up for Rebecca and Jasper. Great to have you. Great to have you. And we're about to see you in Chicago, aren't we? Both of you are going to be there. And this is just pure chance, I guess, or luck of the draw. Very nice.
Actually, we're going kind of together. So we're going to be roomies for like half a week. So that's great.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm really excited for to meet you both. Well, I mean, I've met Rebecca before, of course, but like to get together with Ian Wenzel and Darren Large and Chris Catrone, and we'll get to see a bunch of other familiar faces. And yeah, I just wanted to welcome you both on, but then also say so a lot of the conversation towards the second half revolved around Rebecca's contribution, and so yeah, Rebecca, I don't know if you want to read it because you straight up can. It's still in the live chat, but you can all.
No,
which,
also,
good.
I
It's
copied
good.
and pasted it into a form because, in all honesty, like this like point, which is made very concisely and very short, right, is like the basis of a whole paper I would love to write. I mean, it's part of my own sort of system of thought in general. So I thought I would clip it, put it somewhere so that I have it for reference later.
Yeah, no, it's a good little.
So I can go ahead and read that.
Like an abstract,
So here's what I wrote in chat earlier. I keep thinking about nature in the context of ontological incompleteness. I keep wanting to transpose the disjunction between human deviation and human nature onto nature itself. Like thinking in opposition to the idea of nature as a self-consistent, closed system, maybe we can think of nature as always in contradiction with itself. If so, humans aren't unique in our deviation from some nature, humans aren't unique. Yeah, humans aren't unique in our deviation from some nature, but in the way this impasse gets singled out. In this sense, the phrase "man is a political animal" gains an even deeper meaning, since politics is precisely about the issue of social impasse. So, what is human nature is the pure expression of the impasse of nature itself, right? So the idea is once again, like the central here is we see how there is this question whenever we talk about human nature that we seem to want to say there is a human nature and then there is us going off course. There is some kind of like deviation that we make, and which is part of why we even feel the need to make a point about human nature to begin with, right? So that we can say that there's like a nature, purpose, and a form that is like the way we should be or are supposed to be in some way. And there's some kind of break or deviation or separation that we have from that. And it's represented in different ways. We could talk about society, we could talk about technology. There's different ways that we focus on how this break, where this break is supposed to occur. But what I find interesting is the idea of actually transposing that break, which seems like it's uniquely human, onto nature itself and saying maybe nature is already in a certain kind of like contradiction with itself, that there is a certain kind of impasse or negativity inherent to nature that we express in a singular and unique way. So in with like so with the emergence of the human on the scene, you have this very like impasse itself, which finds its purest expression, but it's already there in nature, is the idea. And
Okay.
that a lot comes from my influence from Slavoj Žižek and Alenka Zupancic and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and so I think, and then Nina, I think, I don't know, what did you think about how she engages with this idea? Because my impression, and I want to hear yours, was that she's very open to this and actually likes it. But there's also a there. Now, I think part of it might be,
Yeah,
is
well,
it,
I know, I,
am I correct though, in there's a distinction here between nature that is some ideal state, and then there's a fall/deviance from it. And then, so it's like there's the way people are behaving, and then there's like how we want them to behave. And we're like, well, the way we want you to behave is actually this way that is natural, and we need to get back to that. And that's what everyone's arguing against. Whereas on the other side, there is nature as contradictory, lacking, incomplete. There's an impasse, right? And that this is the major ontological distinction between these two ways of thinking about nature. Is that right?
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
But the thing that we sort of hashed out a little bit when I was talking with Nina was that like what I'm trying to pose is not that, oh, this idea of nature as contradictory as human nature as itself, the singular expression of like pure like self-contradiction or whatever, um, that this then is the picture that defines how we should generalize about nature. Rather, it's not exactly what I'm saying. Um, like what the implication of what I'm saying is that there's always kind of a gap or impasse relative to nature and the human expression of nature. And that there is still always this attempt, there's still always this natural inclination towards creating when attempting to grasp or understand, comprehend the reality of nature, that we create a sense of the order of nature, because in a sense we are ordering beings. We that is like how we grasp the world, is through an ordering and through a structuring. So there is always an attempt to sort of order or structure nature. We could also talk about that in terms of its historicity, right? Like given a particular historical circumstance, situation, we might see nature differently. Um, but that there remains this impasse, this gap, which maybe is disavowed, even necessarily so, in our efforts to comprehend or understand nature within our particular situation or context. So it's not trying to say, okay, we have to hold like we hold open the space, like we hold contradiction as our nature, which is actually difficult, right? This is actually really hard to actually acknowledge contradiction or impasse as part of nature, our nature or nature itself, but rather to say that there is this sort of in our thinking about nature to try to hold in mind this empty spot, even though like we ultimately can't. That is not the thing. That is not the nature that we are speaking about, right? It's the prop. It's like the or the Kleineman, we could say. It's the swerve that sort of is a part of nature that we can account for to a certain extent, but can't necessarily always can't like form a formal structure or even like ethical. Like maybe we could think about it ethically, but like yeah, I think you get where I'm going. It's It's not between one side or the other, contradictory or like order. It's yeah.
And this is very in line with the kinds of stuff that Mikey has said whenever the question of the good or the natural comes up. And I think it is kind of like a very Ljubljana school approach, and that's awesome to have represented here. So with that said, then I want to take it back here to what I think this all kind of comes to, a head. So we've got nature as fall / deviance from nature. We got nature as contradictory, lacking complete impasse. We've got nature as Bildung. And I think primarily I think of it in terms of maybe like that, Bildung. I would say if I have to say like there's an ontological fundamental reality or whatever, I think that this Ljubljana school approach makes total sense. But then if we're talking about like normative ethics or politics, that's where the whole question of priestcraft comes in, right? And so the title of this stream being a monasteries or church and churches are what? Like, what are they? I want to talk about the idea that in any human population, there will be norms, there will be averages, there will be certain tendencies in the population that can be harnessed or suppressed, right? Cultivated or discouraged. And that the tendency for people like us to identify with the liminal, with the exception, with the lack at the core of subjectivity, and to think deeply about the true fundamental nature of sort of, the code of the universe, is itself like an exception to the rule, and that most people not only don't think this way, like I'm open to the idea that they can't. Now, a big part of me wants to say everyone can, and that's the Enlightenment ideal that Kant was for, but I'm also open to the idea that most people can't or would not want to. They would rather kill themselves. Like I'm open to the idea that I have a lot of people in my life who they just hate the sound of anything related to whatever we do, but they love me and they're just like, rock on, you do what you do, Dave, but I'm an idiot. I don't care about that kind of stuff. And it's like Arendt says in On Revolution that there's one of the most precious rights is the right to be non-political. It's like a very bourgeois thing. The right to be non-political, to opt out from politics, to not be forced to go sit in meetings or what have you. I think there's a lot of people who don't want to be professional revolutionaries or intellectuals or professors or artists or engineers or inventors. And a lot of people kind of want to, they just don't want to be miserable, and they want a shoe that fits and is comfortable, but also it has to be cool. And it has to give them belonging in the world. And so they don't want to have to create their identity from scratch. And they kind of need a reliable sort of archetypical constellation of reference points to live in relation to at the level of habitus to field, not an intellectual game, right? And so then we think about identities and ideologies as things that function to give people that kind of home in their worlds. And then we come along, the critical theory types, and we're all like, the normal is actually not the natural, is actually not the good. And people are like, oh, I hate this, But the thing is normies have been radicalized. A lot of normies have been radicalized. NPR listening normies have been radicalized over the last 10 years and are like anti-white supremacy, settler colonialism, resistance. And on the other side, real edgy right-wing shit. And so it's like normies have themselves been successfully radicalized by the conditions, by the medium, by the messages, by the whole situation. And so what I'm interested in is a possibility that people who are going to be more responsible and rigorous about belief and about what we think about as like the fundamental reality of nature or lack thereof, might actually have some kind of a calling or responsibility to show up for and be in relation to the normies in a way that is, developing identities or avenues for stylizations of life that could work for like 80% of people to 90% of people reliably and make life less miserable, right? And I'm thinking about that and taking it seriously. And I don't know if Benjamin, you haven't really said what your thoughts are on that whole idea, but the tie-in back is like, you're about to give a lecture on Aquinas. We're talking about the church. We're talking about the church's Bildung. We're talking about the whole idea of nature, meaning Bildung or the church, like comes from Aquinas in a sort of sense. And so this could be a cool little segue into the lecture you're giving on Sunday.
Well, it predates Aquinas. You know, Aquinas is having to defend it from some of the problems that it faces. But yes, there is. So the idea of the laity is the flock which has to be led by the shepherd. And the laity is not going to be able to figure out what it's meant to do without the shepherd. So you can't actually be a man on this view if you're not in the community. And the community is the community of the church. And there are some people who will not fit into the standard kinds of roles that the church offers to the local village. And those people might go up the hill to the monastery and go live with the monks if they're not able to figure out how to be okay in the village by going to church. So in this way, the Catholic Church tried to create many different possibilities for different kinds of people, all of whom were still framed as equal before God. So it's not as if these people's souls were superior or inferior. You know, this is a major difference from some of the Greeks who will hold a sharper kind of hierarchy potentially. But even though they're all equal before God, the specific capabilities they develop outfit them for different kinds of temporal roles, different levels of temporal power, political power, power within the church. So the education of the priests, you know, initially this is something which occurs through the monasteries. So the monasteries were, before the university system was created, the only real educational institution that existed. And there was a demand for the monasteries to provide a certain amount of education to people who would not then stay in the monastery, but would become lords or would become priests, so that the lords or priests would be better educated and wouldn't just be, you know, big thugs, but would actually be able to, you know, engage with things like legal concepts, engage with you know, church ideas. And so the monasteries, to get support from the kings and from the popes, had to offer a kind of exoteric education for these kinds of people. So the monks produced priests, they produced nobles, and then gradually over time, the need for this kind of education grew and grew and grew to the point at which the medieval schoolhouses develop into universities and kind of usurp the centrality which the monastery previously had. So it becomes, you're going to have much more impact on medieval society if you're teaching as a lecturer in the university than if you're the abbot of the monastery. Because as the lecturer in the university, you're going to shape and form a much greater number of people than the abbot in the monastery can possibly shape or form. So you get to a stage where it's actually more prestigious to be a big name university lecturer than it is to be an abbot in a monastery. And you get to a stage where more and more people go through the university and they never actually spend any time in the monastery. Or even if they're a member of a monastic order, their career is in the university system. They're not living a monastic life. And they might still have an affiliation with a monastic order. They might be a Dominican or a Franciscan, and the order might in some way get a benefit from their being a university lecturer, because whatever income they get, the order might oversee that. If they're in an order which is committed to the idea that its members can't own property, then anything that they would get for the university teaching would be managed by the order rather than their own property. So there was still a sense in which the monasteries had an incentive to continue to supply teachers here. But gradually what happens is that the university system becomes more and more autonomous, fewer and fewer people go into the monasteries, and you get to a stage where this university education is kind of taken over the whole structure. All of this is to say that your priest at the local church is a kind of mid-wit bureaucrat by design. The priest is not a monk, is not a saint, is someone who has been given a kind of minimal level of theological training for the purposes of shepherding a flock. And it's only the priests who are the most capable and have the most ability that would be moved up from parish priest and would then be given other jobs further up the chain. And the way in which they would get promoted is that people further up the chain would pick them to come further up on the basis of their displaying that they have further kinds of qualities, virtues, characteristics necessary to come up. So not only would you have, your laity, which is assumed to not really be able to get that serious into the religion, and your monks, but you would also then have these priests who are more temporal than your monks, but certainly more spiritual than your laity. And this continues to be a point of frustration. Like Raymond Geuss in his book, Not Thinking Like a Liberal. Yeah, he talks about this this issue with the church that his parents went to was this church for workers, and it simply told them repeatedly that they have to work hard so as to get into heaven and not go to hell. But in his school, which was operated also by the Catholic Church, there was this possibility that some of the people in the school could be people who might need to be brought into a spiritual life or moved up the chain or given university education. So the kind of education that he received in the Catholic school was totally different from the kind of teaching that he would get at the church. And this is still the case in many American towns. You'll even notice that there's often multiple different Catholic churches in a town of some size, and these churches will be skewed toward particular kinds of people. So in my hometown, Valparaiso, there are two churches, two Catholic churches. One has a more, you might think of it as liberal, but it's more concerned with poverty and the poor and charitable works. And another is more concerned with family morality and maintaining a way of producing successful professional class people. And these, of course, are both Catholic churches that are committed to the same thing, but they have a different emphasis. They talk about different things so as to pick up a different part of the community. And so if you don't like what's going on at the one, you can go to the other or vice versa. And in this way, the two churches, while they seem like they're different from each other, are actually serving the same ultimate end. So this is how pluralism, functions within the Middle Ages. There is this plurality of types, plurality of people who have different kinds of needs or preferences, and the church finds ways of incorporating all of them to the degree to which they can be incorporated, and it makes judgments about specific people and about the degrees to which they can all be incorporated.
How feasible do you think something like that actually is if you try to do it purposefully? And was the university to schooling system, including K through 12 and other, European versions of this, predecessors, not like a secularization of sorts of this idea?
Well, yeah, initially it was still very much baked in the church because the university lecturers were literally members of monastic orders in the opening centuries. And then gradually this changes. But even into the 1700s, even into the early 1800s, if you went to Oxford or Cambridge, the primary function of those universities was still training priests. What we think of as the modern university comes out of the Prussian university system. And the Prussian university system has what we think of as the academic disciplines and the subjects that are, so many different discrete subjects. This is really something that didn't fully come about until the 19th century. It's very, very modern. And then there's a period of catch-up where the Americans and the British are copying the Prussian universities. So just as you hear this story all the time about our public schools, that our public schools are based on a Prussian model, the same is also true of our universities. Our universities are imitations of German universities in terms of the subject structure. Now, it's still the case that at Oxford or Cambridge, a lot of the instruction occurs in these buildings from the previous kind of university that existed at earlier points. And many of the traditions and so on are still grandfathered in from that previous structure. But the universities only very, very gradually became secular until this point in the 19th century, where it happened very, very quickly, seemingly kind of all at once. And so now we have a university system which still performs this kind of function. It decides in terms of who it gives degrees to, who it admits, who it doesn't, where people can be, and it selects for different kinds of traits or capacities or skills. It's open to the idea that they acquire those traits and capacities socially or through any kind of process. It doesn't make claims about where the talent or capacity or skills come from. It's indifferent to and agnostic about those questions. But nevertheless, it still sorts. It still says you can do this, therefore you can have this degree. You can't do this, therefore you can't. Now, more recently, we've gotten away from this because people have had this image of who they think should be in these roles that's based on a prefab notion of what would be fair or equitable. And so there's been an attempt to get the universities to move people into roles on the basis of this prefab notion of where people belong, which then results in people ending up in roles that they maybe shouldn't be in, which then leads to a reaction in which people then claim that people from various different kinds of groups can't perform roles or shouldn't be in them. But it's all very confused because really the university system still performs a function which was originally laid out a long, long time ago, but it does it without a lot of the terminology or background concepts that used to be invoked to explain, justify, and legitimate that activity.
Along the lines of what Dave said, I was kind of wondering, is it a problem for your plans to like create a monastery or something that you don't have control over all of society? You don't actually have access to a lot of people that you could then sort. Like you have me and Rebecca, and you can choose if one of us gets to like moderate something in the Discord, but like that's that's kind of it.
Yeah, so originally when the monasteries were getting going, they didn't perform this role. It wasn't until the Middle Ages got well underway that the monks were asked to train these other classes. Prior to this point, the monks were organizing as kind of dropout Roman aristocrats. So if you look at when the monasteries first got going, it was because these people were sick of the Roman rhetoric schools that they felt were not offering real education. They wanted to have education which was in alignment with God, in alignment with a particular abstraction that they felt was not given sufficient emphasis or pride of place in the rhetoric schools, which were oriented toward other ends that they considered vulgar. And so the original starting point of the monasteries in late antiquity is very different from the role that they eventually ended up in part as a consequence of the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the need to jerry-rig together some new kind of order that could be functional. So when we talk about this idea in our context today, no, I would never dream of being in the position of a monastery in the 1200s or the 1100s or the 1000s or the 900s or the 800s or the 700s or the 600s or the 500s or the 400s. If we were to do something like that today, it would be informed by the kind of context that generated monasteries. There would have to be something in accordance with our context and that context. So the universities would have to have been debased to the point at which they would be no better than the rhetoric schools of late antiquity. And this would have to be obvious enough to enough of us that we would feel spurred in some way to make a new institution which can perform a function which those can't. And for this to happen, we would have to be motivated by some abstraction. To the degree to which these dropouts, these Roman Christian dropouts, were motivated by their notion of God to actually make and then sustain together these communities in an environment where they were being persecuted for their beliefs and for their desire to make these things initially. So, yeah, no, nothing like that. When we talk about monasteries in the High Middle Ages, we're talking about the monasteries as they are beginning to come apart, not when they are coming together originally. The Middle Ages is the end. The 1200s, Aquinas, this is the end of something. It's not the start.
And how far apart is Augustine from Aquinas? And is he more like the early side of that, or?
Augustine is closer to the early side of it. You're talking about more than half a millennium still.
Yeah, I know. It's just all one big blob.
700, 700 or so years. So when Augustine is operating, the Western Roman Empire is still a thing. And right before Augustine dies, his city is being besieged by the Vandals. So it's in the process of falling right before he dies. So Augustine, at the point at which Rome gets sacked, Augustine writes the City of God, to make this case, because a lot of the pagans are saying, see, Rome has been sacked because it's become Christian, and in becoming Christian, it's becoming capable of defending itself. It's angered the gods. It has produced this by becoming Christian. And Augustine is saying, no, that isn't really the case. And actually, you have to have some kind of if you're going to have a temporal state, it would have to be able to be in some way or shape or form in accordance with God. So there's this question of, to what degree can a city of man be like a city of God? To what degree are Roman practices compatible with this? To what degree do they have to change? And what does this ultimately look like? What does a Christian empire look like? And Augustine has an interest in making a Christian empire. At the time at which Augustine is living, there are some Christians who are concerned about making a Christian empire. They think that this might be a mistake. They think that it will cause a transformation of their practices because they will become politicized. These schools, which are being formed by people who are trying to escape Roman institutions, will be in some way reabsorbed into Roman institutions, which is indeed what happens. And so for these people, this represents a threat to the actual integrity of the project, which of course on some level it did. At the same time, if you are convinced that this is something that should go to everyone in principle, if from a Christian perspective, everyone is equal before God, then the fact that many people are alienated from God because they are not Christian, because the empire is not Christian, this is a major problem and something that you would feel compelled on some level as a Christian to try to change. So Augustine makes the case that yes, through imperial institutions, you will get something that does not produce a Christianity for saints, but it will produce a Christianity that is able to absorb a much larger number of people from many, many more backgrounds, and that these people will then get saved. These people can be saved even if they're not saints. But some of the sects at the time within Christianity held the view that actually the goal should be to live in a saint-like way, and that therefore these people who are not willing to undertake Christianity to that degree should not be in it. So there's a question even from the beginning among these guys, should you even try to share this out exoterically with ordinary rank and file Romans? Is this even something you should attempt? And Augustine, in saying that it should happen and that there is potentially a way in which it could happen, is already arguing for a transformation of these structures, which originally were created in a period of persecution. So yeah, we haven't even made the structures that Augustine is talking about politicizing. We are, if we were to make something like this, we would be in a pre-Augustine period where we would have no possibility of politicizing them even to that degree.
I would like to do
Okay,
a full
then
thing
where's
where
the
we
possibility?
I'd like to do a whole thing where we actually kind of focus in on what would those conditions look like if they were close enough to matter in this era, with the material conditions being as different as they are, and like to actually focus in on that. But I don't want to do that right now because I do have to close this out in the next 15 minutes because I do have to go do something with Anne in a minute. And Anne is in the other room actually still waiting to say something about adolescence, which actually is going to tie into all of this stuff. And so really quickly, I just wanted to loop Anne back in here. The love of my life, my wife, Anne Snellgrove McKerracher, just binged Adolescence. And so I've been watching it. And it's fascinating from a purely filmmaking standpoint because it's every episode is one long cut. There's no cuts. It's just all one scene. And so the camera just goes and it follows people the whole hour. And every episode's like that. And it's wild actually. And so she was saying something earlier about how there's this some people think it's trying to be all woke and blame incels for all the problems or whatever. And I agree that does not, I don't think anyone making those kinds of arguments is doing themselves any favors, because if you're going to look at this and think about, and that's all you can think about, you're missing out on something really cool. And so with that said, Anne, can you hear it right now?
Yeah.
Oh, sweet. I can't see you because the camera's not on, but you're right there with us. Cool. Good to know. I was like, what if she's not there? Okay.
Here.
Yo, welcome.
Voice. Thank you. Yeah. Is there any Do you want to say anything
I just wanted you to tell
about
everyone
Adolescence
kind of.
to get me going, or just want me to?
Yeah, I guess I'll just say
Go.
like, okay, so the schooling system is bad, and that actually shows through in this show, and it's actually it's like torture, and it's really like hurting these kids. But the protagonist and his friends, they are like these incel kids. Spoiler alert. And so
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't really matter. We don't do spoilers here, so it's the story stands up no matter what you know about it going in. So, but yeah, just say what you want to say about it. I'll tie it back into the idea of Bildungmech. I want to talk about Bildungmech and the stakes of structural stultification and why we care about it, regardless of whether we are considering ourselves as leftists or not. Why we care about Bildungmech and how that might relate to theurgy, and what are the sort of analogies we want to be drawing with the university or church of old in terms of how they work with large populations of human beings. Okay. But for now, let's just focus on this, the story of this poor kid, or these poor kids.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to frame it. Like the poor kid. I think this show is a very, very empathetic kind of look into the tumultuous life of like being a child, particularly a young boy with unrestricted access to the internet and absent parents. It's also very empathetic to the parents. I think it's the way that it is filmed, because it is filmed in this one shot, and like you're watching these people walk up the stairs and drive their car, and you're seeing all these moments between the action. Now, obviously, you can only ever see one person at a time. It can't follow everyone at once. That in itself is a very human view, like a human. You're there. You're watching this story play out. It's not being chopped up. You're there in this hour-long moment with any given character. And so, yeah, that's where I think the discourse around the show, because I've seen quite a lot of it, again, like just on my own kind of Instagram feed, even some Substack articles on like, everyone needs to watch this show because this show is a warning against the dangers of online incel culture. And it's like, that's like a fraction of the show. And I definitely think that does have merit, and that is an important thing, because I believe that the story, and so here's kind of the spoiler alert, which you would find out in the first episode anyways, and if you're seeing people talking about it, then you kind of should know like what the story is about. The story is about a young 13-year-old boy named Jamie, who is accused of and ultimately pleads guilty to murdering one of his classmates, his female classmates, stabbing her 7 times, like at night. He like follows her and stabs her. And so that is like genuinely a very scary thing to think about, because already in the United States, school kids have to not always worry about, but there is always that fear of, oh, is there going to be a mass shooting at my school today? When you're a woman walking through the parking lot at night, you kind of just have to be aware, like, oh, is someone going to try to kidnap me? It's not a fear that should take over your life. Like, real things happen, and we just all have to be aware of the space and the people around us, because there are bad people. And so the fact that this story is based off of like a true event where, a young boy is like stabs a young girl to death. Oh, you're telling me now we got to worry about 13-year-old boys stabbing women? Like, we've already had to kind of worry about the young loner boy school shooter. Like, that's been a concern. And so that is definitely an important thread of the show, because that ultimately is what sparks Jamie's rampage, his anger. But I think that is such a, again, small part of what the show is about. I think the show, because I've heard all these stories of, oh, it's about this, it's about incel culture and the online manosphere and how dangerous it is, I thought the show would be a lot more focused on that topic. And it's really not. It's only like, maybe a fifth, a sixth of like the importance of the content and the context and the story And I think ultimately what the show is about is just like the struggle of men and being a dad and being parents to young boys, the struggle of boys in the schooling system. It takes place in the UK. They're all in uniforms, and I think their classrooms looked to be, at least some of them, like sex segregated. So a little bit different than the US, but kind of the same, like behavioral problems, same problems of teachers being overworked and underpaid, and they're all just kind of like watching films in their classrooms and being rambunctious. And like every few minutes when they're in this school scene, you hear a teacher say, "Put your phone away, put your phone away." So it's about like the presence of phones and how that influences us. But I think a central theme that I think is being missed in the talk and the focus on, manosphere and incel online culture is like male anger, and just I think anger in general. Our current situation in the West, I think, has made a lot of people angry. Like part of it's individualism, and on this tour, as we've been driving all over, and we have Will with us, who's from the UK, and he's like, "Oh my gosh, you Americans are like," not us on the tour, we're great drivers, but like people get road rage and are assholes and don't think about anyone else when they're driving. And someone will be in the wrong. Like this happened to me even before we left on tour. Someone literally did an illegal turn, cut me off, like it was whatever, and I gave him the good old thumbs down. I'm like, not good. And he flipped me off. It's like, bro, you almost killed me. Why am I getting flipped off? So I think is like just the struggles of men, raising boys, and anger, and how that can manifest in a time when parents are kind of separated from their, or kids are separated from their parents because they're locked away in school. Their parents don't have any time, energy from them. The parents, are trying to not be like their parents who would just beat them. Like it just used to be the norm. Oh, you just whip out the belt and beat your child. That is another manifestation of like anger that gets built up in people. And so the parents at the end of this show, in the last episode, like that's where people are really missing, I think, the theme of the show, because they only focus on like this one scene in episode 3, which, spoiler alert, so the show starts off on day 1 with like the police and detectives and like a team of like SWAT looking people somewhere in the UK busting into this kid's house and like arresting him at 6 in the morning.
Just a little kid.
They take him to the police station. Yeah, 13-year-old boy.
And the parents are obviously reacting the way that any parent would react in that situation. Like, what? Just absolutely like,
they're like,
no, this is not real. Yeah. They don't believe it at all.
Yeah. Yeah. And so saying, I haven't done anything wrong. It wasn't me. I didn't do anything. So you go through the process of him getting checked into the police station and getting, his rights told to him. The episode ends with he has to have an appropriate adult with him because he's underage. He chooses to have his dad with him. And so he's in the room being questioned by these detectives. And like the final scene, Jamie, solicitor or lawyer, had told him previously, don't answer any questions about where you were the night that this happened. So he's saying, no comment on some of these questions. And finally they say, okay, yeah, well, here's like video footage of you from local.
It's really clever the way it builds up. First they start showing him pictures. These are your shoes, right? And he's acting like he doesn't know. And then eventually, obviously, he has to concede that these are his shoes.
This is you following her, right? Yeah. From surveillance cameras, in the town, and they have an actual a video of Jamie stabbing this girl to death.
And the dad is just sitting there. the dad is just sitting there having to see it. And the dad's acting is the thing that sold me on the show. This dad's acting is absolutely incredible. They give him a ton of camera time, and it's absolutely worth watching just for the dad's acting in the pilot episode. If nobody wants to finish the show, just at least watch it for the dad, because I really, as I want to become a father, like I'm always like really impressed by anything that does really good stuff with the father experience or whatever. Like I don't know, like any, like that's why I like Trap. Remember, like that's just kind of like a nobody really cared about that movie, but there's a father angle in it that I really liked. And so in this case, yeah, it's like because
fathers are like, no one cares about fathers.
Yeah. And so this was,
I feel like the cultural narrative, fuck men, fuck dads. Not actually, but there's not. Yeah, I think the father, the role of the father in this show is just as important as like the warning on incel culture. And so that's episode 1. Episode 2 just follows the detectives going into the school and talking to the students, and that's where another scene or another episode that is just completely being left out of the conversation, I think, with the problem of the school system and the way that just, I think, social media and being online all the time has impacted all of the students, boys and girls alike. Like the boys in the school are just little shitheads, but the girls are kind of little shitheads too. Problems, they're being terrible to each other. The best friend of the girl died, ends up like whipping the shit out of one of Jamie's friends, who we find out at the end of that episode gave Jamie his knife.
Right.
So there's tension in the school. The school system itself is broken.
It's worth noting that these girls had been bullied. You find out these girls had been bullying these boys, and so it's like, which came first? Did they get into the manosphere because they were being bullied by these girls who were calling them incels? Or you know what I mean? Chicken or the egg. And so it's like, I don't actually know at this point where I'm at in the show. And so, yeah, so I want to tie it all back to, Anne, is there anything, I guess I want to give you a chance to kind of close it for now.
Yeah, I just want to close out this little arc really quick, because I'm getting to episode 3 takes place 7 months later. And this is the scene, the episode that people are focusing on the most in the discourse. So Dave, spoiler alert, I guess. But the whole episode is basically a session between Jamie, and it's not a therapist, but it's like, I don't know.
Like a forensic psychologist?
Yeah, like someone who's there to kind of just make an assessment of him and his understanding of the situation, his understanding of kind of life itself, kind of do a mental health assessment by just probing and asking questions that she will then give to the judge. So the judge has an understanding of Jamie's understanding. Like they say this a lot. This episode, like acting performance-wise, is absolutely incredible. But the scenes that are making people point to, oh, it's about incel manosphere stuff, is because there's 2 times within this episode where Jamie like gets up in this woman's face. It's like, you don't control me. Get that through your little brain. Like this 13-year-old screaming at like 30-year-old woman. Like we're probably saying, a dominating way. I don't respect her kind of way. But it's so much deeper than that. And so that's what people latch onto. And then there's seemingly very little talk about the next episode, which happens a couple months later, or a few months later. And it's just the family. So Jamie's not even in this episode, and it's the dad's birthday. And they're trying to have a normal birthday, but like they're all dealing with the fact that, you know, their son and his sister, Lisa, like he's been gone for over a year. He's been in this like detention facility waiting for the trial. And so this is where we really see the dad struggling emotionally. We see the way that he interacts with his wife, which is not, I don't want to say it's necessarily toxic, but there's definitely like he's not emotionally available. He hasn't been emotionally available to his kids. He thought he was doing the right thing. Like, you see these parents like trying to struggle with the fact that they raised a boy like Jamie, and they just, they did what they thought was their best, and he wanted to computer, and so they got him a computer, and he was just in his room. How could he have been doing any harm? But there was no monitoring or conversations of what he was doing online. But at the same time, they have this daughter who's like, she's on her phone a lot too. Half the episode, and it's very realistic, just like the way that she's kind of on her phone.
It's so realistic.
As they're spending time as a family. It's again like incredible performing.
It's
so
actually the first. No,
I
just wanted a quick aside say at the level of form, I've become over the last year very irritated by shows or movies that really bring me in on something super dramatic and then leave it on a cliffhanger by switching to a different point in time. And so like what's really special about this whole thing at the level of form is just that each episode, there is no cuts. You are along for the ride just the whole time. And so it's totally fascinating. But yeah, well, I want to tie it back into Bildungmech.
So my closing thought is the parents are grappling with this and trying to understand their role in this and how they could have, just seemingly fine daughter and a son who was capable of this. And so all of that was to say, and I could probably guess, Dave, how you might tie it back in, but I'll let you go in just a second.
No, do it,
All that is to say, the show, I think, is a beautiful, powerful, sad look at like a very, very important problem in society. That is like, what are the options available for men right now, for young boys, young girls too? And you can make that point in the show as well. It's a little bit more subtle, and I think it's about the male struggle. It's an empathetic look at the male struggle. It's an empathetic look at parents and kind of their lack of awareness, that I think soon we're going to be able to say lack of awareness of the dangers of social media isn't going to be an excuse anymore. Everyone should know this. But it's this really focused, personal, humanizing look on a very tragic, very disturbing story based on true stories. And yeah, I strongly recommend the show, but it's about so much more than just men bad incel culture.
Thank you, Anne. Everybody give it up. I love Anne's summaries more than anything. So thank you. Yeah, that was very well put. And none of those spoilers make me feel any it's just more exciting to finish it. So anyway, the point I want to pick up on is where you said, did the parents were trying to deal with the fact that they had raised this kid. And I feel like this is becoming increasingly a problem for working class and middle class parents. I mean, I should say all parents probably feel this way, but especially those that cannot be in their children's lives because they leave in the morning and don't come back until evening, which of course would include many people in the ruling class. But, at least ruling class families, there's usually like a mom who doesn't have to do that. I don't know. That's a bit more common. It's also more common in the middle class in various segments, right? And so that's an argument conservatives will raise, is that the very class that is for polyamory and taking these relationships not so seriously and whatnot will be the ones that are the biggest beneficiaries of marriages between people who stick together. So there's something problematic there, because when those ideas try to get operationalized in the working class, it leads to devastation when people try to be radical individualists who will do everything themselves while at the same time trying to survive, keep their head above water, hand to mouth. And so parents dealing with the structural stultification of Timenergy, which is a communal resource, none of them having it because of the reduction of themselves to labor power that was schooled into them their entire lives, realizing children are not plug and play, realizing that the computer that's plug and play comes along with all of this, like, you could almost call it like, I don't know, like what's the opposite of priest class? What about something that's not meant for social harmony, Benjamin? What's something that's meant to destroy lives? Like incel ideology will destroy your life. If you give into this woman-hating, blaming, scapegoating approach, it will ruin your life. And then, they'll sit there and naturalize it. Oh, well, I don't have a chin. I don't have good bone structure. I'm not going to be able to get a good mate. Oh, it's because of feminism. That there is some of this. This stuff actually exists. It gets overblown. It's maybe by the NPR audience, but it also is real. It's actually a seductive thing. Andrew Tate's a real person. He's actually a big deal. He's one of the, he's actually named in this show. And so there's parents raising their children. There's schools raising those children. This show does not, tacitly put all the blame on the parents. It puts it on the school just as much, if not more, I think. And that's wonderful that they do that. But ultimately, this is the stakes of what we're talking about. This is not just an extreme, though. Like, everybody lives in a situation where we're in reference to the exceptions to the norm. So like metal detectors on the schools. This is a way of trying to deal with an exception to the norm. And so ultimately what we're talking about are like, what do you do with exceptions, and how do you cultivate, harness, and strategically repress exceptions so that the general norm can be good, can be something better than miserable.
Well, I think part of the trouble is that right now what's governing what happens to children is not any thinking about how those children will turn out. During COVID, it became clear that nobody cares how the children actually turn out or whether they develop any capacities. What is determining how it works is simply, how do you enable the parents to continue to go to work? How do you enable the parents to continue to go to work? And the assumption is that the kids will figure it out. The assumption is that the world of the future will be so different that the kids will figure it out, or that the kind of education that they need is incomprehensible to people who are currently adults, and therefore there's no need for any kind of real theory of it. We have reached a point where nobody cares about generating even the basic capacities that are necessary for children to be able to do what used to be considered work, or what might be considered work in the future. And the only concept of it that the adults seem to have is coding and learning to code. And then they abolish the jobs that involve that too. So I don't think that at this point there is real theory of any kind going into how this is being done. I think we've reached a stage where capitalism has become indifferent to its own future because it assumes that it will provide for itself. It has a kind of overconfidence in its capacity to produce people who are narrowly able to do the things that it requires, and it assumes that it can technologically automate or otherwise deal with any gaps or import people from other parts of the world insofar as it's not able to generate the relevant capacities at home. I think we're at a stage where there's such a profound indifference to the capacities people acquire that we do have to ask if there really is a need to completely rethink how we build and make people. And if there is a need to completely rethink that, then there's entirely different institutional forms that are required that have to be constructed from the ground up by people through a kind of social organizing. And I think there's a lot of chatter about social organizing lately, but not a lot of thinking about what it actually needs to do. What it actually needs to do is make people who have capacities to deal with the future, so that they can actually make sense of the situation as it's being constructed and then act in it. And this is not going to be done by the capitalist schools. It's just not going to be done by them. Capitalism is not going to produce the kind of education, and indeed it hasn't already. We have seen for a couple of generations now very obvious decline in the quality of these structures. We used to talk about latchkey kids as a problem. Now that's just a given. We're at a stage where people have been rationalizing stuff that was completely unacceptable, that was considered, you will produce little barbarians if you put them through this. 40, 50 years ago, completely obviously unacceptable, now is normal. And people tell you all the time, oh, just have kids and don't think about it. Just have kids and don't think about it. Just throw them into this system and, it's capitalism. They'll be fine. This is not working. It's not working out. And that doesn't mean that, we have to rebuild some kind of pre-capitalist structure, or we have to go back into a time machine or try to return to some misbegotten past. It means we have to make new institutions which generate capacities that are relevant now, which means we have to work with now and what now entails. This is the trouble. We're at a stage where everything is so barbarized that the only way that I can even raise the possibility of the capacities that are required is to talk about incredibly, incredibly ancient conditions under which very small numbers of people achieved certain levels of capacities at enormous, frightening human cost, through slavery and through imperialism and deprivation and all kinds of, and these people would do anything to be able to get these capacities. They would do anything and they would treat anybody any which way to get them, because they understood there to be a difference between one kind of life and another kind of life. And we have just completely lost the ability to distinguish at all. We've rationalized every kind of life as the same. Every kind of life is just as good as any other. And so we don't even recognize what we don't generate in people, and we deny it. We deny completely what we don't generate. And we just make endless excuses. It really has to change. And we have to change it, because none of them will. These people in these institutions, they're comfortable, they're happy, they are still doing just well enough that they don't have to think about this stuff in the kinds of terms in which we're thinking about it. Dave, you're muted.
Thank you. Yeah, a part of that silence was intentional. I was like holding the silence, and then I was like, thank you, everyone. I think that this is a perfect place to wrap it up, because Anne and I have a bunch of stuff we got to go do. And I think that that's where we want to end it. Benjamin, I think that that's how we all feel. And so that's what brings us together here. And I'm excited for your lecture on Sunday. I'm excited for the thing we're going to do on the Weather Underground on Saturday. Jasper, Rebecca, I hope to see you there. Otherwise, we'll be seeing you in the real meet space here in a little bit. Very exciting. Catch y'all on the flip side. Take care. And hey, and if you're watching this or listening, stick around. Listen to the PSA. Took a lot of work to put it together. It's not a commercial. It's our heart. It's our soul. It's our very condition of possibility. It's our only future. Take care.
We cannot do direct revolution, but the only way to lay the foundation for it is to do what you are doing to move the underground. It's a theoretically correct title.
Theory Underground exists to cultivate the conditions necessary for a working-class intellectual renaissance that goes beyond old political categories or other identitarian niches. At TU, autodidact workers with earbuds and professionals who see no future in existing institutions or movements are able to challenge their doxa and develop an understanding of the situation we are in.
If you subscribe at theoryunderground.com, you'll get access to a package of courses, including my Intro to Fault Line Theory, which includes Intro to Nick Land and Intro to Slavoj Žižek. These courses are being woven with the 3 courses that take place on a month-to-month basis, spread out throughout the year of 2025. Those courses are 12 Core Concepts and the Fundamental Problems with the Situation Today with social theorist David McKerracher, 12 Essential Political Thinkers with political theorist Benjamin Studebaker, and The Philosophy of Nature with philosopher Nina Power.
The way these all get woven together at a deeper and more meta level is through the ongoing research seminars led by David McKerracher, Benjamin Studebaker, and Michael Downs, where they engage with one another's work by sharing developments from their own perspectives, theory, and research.
If you subscribe at higher levels and support our work, we'll support your development with bespoke teaching. Alone and unaided, we struggle to grasp our situation in its fullness and formulate a meaningful response. By working together and pooling our energies, we can do better. Join us at theoryunderground.com/subscribe.
There'll be 2 kinds of people in 10 years. Those who said, I knew all along Theory Underground was going to make this huge difference. Those are the people that are like Nance, who were on the sidelines at one point and then said, nah, I'm going to get in. I'm going to roll up my sleeves and I'm going to go hard. And then there's another kind of person, a person who waits in the wings, collects receipts, and who will say in 10 years, oh yeah, I was there. I saw that happen. and then they'll gossip monger. Listen, if you want to get involved, get involved. But if you're going to sit there in the bleachers, well, here's some popcorn. I hope you have fun.